Welcome to the Bible Feed podcast. I'm Dan Weatherall and I'm here with Paul Davenport again. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Dan.
Great to be talking again about prophets. So that's the topic of what we're doing. That's the little sort of mini-series that we've been doing, thinking about the prophets. And we're in the middle of Isaiah, aren't we? So we've got to pick back up where we left off and close out the book of Isaiah. So
yeah, that's right. We left that one hanging halfway through.
That's right. That's the aim for today. But because we're about halfway through, I think it's been a little bit of a time as well since we last looked at prophets earlier this year. So we're going to do a brief recap. So at this point, we've got to make sure that this doesn't turn into half the episode, Paul. So let's try and make sure we don't do that. But the first episode on the prophets, we asked the question, who were the prophets? So we thought about the fact that they're quite an unusual genre, this collection of prophets in the books that we call the prophets in the Bible. Not really a clear modern equivalent, but I think you were advocating they were like protest movements almost, or holding power to account kind of movement.
Yeah, there's some similarities with that as a modern equivalent. It's not a perfect analogy.
No, not at all. No, but there's a little bit of that, performing spectacles in public squares or taking an oracle of judgment to the rulers and kings and things like that. But they're also, the literature that they wrote that we're reading are poetic, they're dramatic, and also a lot of the high context, I think we talked about. So there's a lot of assumed background to them. So that's something that we have to grapple with as we read them.
We thought about how, given it's such an unfamiliar genre, how we should read them and explore them in the modern world, if you like. And I guess the biggest difference between the sort of protest movement comparison that we made is that we think the prophets were delivering a message that was from God. They're inspired and they're delivering something that God is intending to communicate to us. And we sort of explored, again, albeit simplistically, the two sort of extremes as to how the prophets have been read historically, a couple of different approaches. One is, and we looked at some of the headings in, I think it was the King James Bible, that where the chapter is clearly about Israel, the heading of the chapter that the translators have provided is, this is about the church. And it's replace Israel with the church, and these messages are to the church. That's one way in which prophets have been interpreted in the past. Another way is that, the prophets are speaking to an ancient people, Israel, but, about events that are happening in their day, but about things that are future. And embedded and coded into that message to Israel of old are things which the people of old would have no idea about, but it's a sort of encoded message about the end times. And that's another kind of popular way of looking at prophecy. Those two different ways, simplistic and sort of extreme ways, and you wouldn't really double down on either of those methods. And so we talked about a third way of reading and thinking about the prophets, and in particular focusing on them and thinking about them in the context of the covenant, which is a huge part of the Old Testament scriptures, the covenant between God and his people, Israel, and seeing the prophets as these sort of champions of the covenant, or almost covenant enforcers, bringing the people back continually, repeatedly to the covenant. And the whole cycle and message of these prophets is that despite the repeated occasions on which human beings failed to honour their part in that covenant, and that kind of repeated human failing, God sticks with it. He continues to work with human beings. He maintains his covenant. He maintains the promise. And ultimately what starts to emerge is this promise of an individual who would be a deliverer from the underlying kind of problem of human behavior and sin, which would lead to this ideal kind of covenant restoration in which blessings come upon all people. And that's the sort of framework in which to perhaps read the prophets.
Good. Okay, thanks for that. So let's move on to the next episode that we did, which is Isaiah part 1. So this is leading directly into what we're going to be talking about now. So we basically went straight through the first half of Isaiah. We thought about the historical context, that kind of thing, which was...
Yeah, so we thought, having talked generally about what the prophets were, we'd go into probably the most well-known, not quite the biggest, but one of the biggest prophets. And it's set, certainly the first half of the prophecy is set at the time of this Assyrian crisis in the history of ancient Israel, which is an invasion by Assyrian armies from the north and there are warnings about it for this little kingdom of Judah, with King Ahaz first of all, and then King Hezekiah, who features quite significantly in the prophets, in the Psalms, and in the historical records in Kings and Chronicles. And there's this point in time when Hezekiah is about to die and the city of Jerusalem is about to be taken, and it all looks completely bleak and desperate and without hope. And then there's relief from that situation of what looks like complete hopelessness. And that's an event. It is a historical event. We know when this Assyrian invasion happened and when it failed in 701 BC. So there's good historical and archaeological evidence for that.
Yeah. If people really want to go diving into our archives, I think something like episode 7 or something like that, we did the Bible and history and looked at the Hezekiah and evidence around that. So that's something for people to look out. But so the book of Isaiah, I think we talked a little bit about who might have written it. So obviously Isaiah being one prominent candidate for that. Yes. But there's talk of 2 Isaiahs, aren't there? Or sometimes even 3, isn't there? In the scholarly circles, second Isaiah. And we're going to move into the part of the book that's referred to that, aren't we? So did we think a little bit about that? Yeah,
so we addressed that a little bit. And so the section we looked at was up to chapter 39, chapters 1 to 39 last time. And now we're going to look at chapters 40 to 66. And because of some of the content and different approaches in the second half, it has been proposed that there's part of it, the first part of it is written by Isaiah of Jerusalem, and then there's a later author that writes the second half more at the time of the Babylonian crisis, the sort of a set of events that happens about 100 years after the Assyrian crisis. That's one crisis after another for the people of Israel. We said, first of all, that there's no hard manuscript evidence for there being 2 different source documents, if you like, that have been brought together to form the book that we've got now. We'd also say, from our point of view as the prophets being inspired by God, that it's not necessary that content that sounds like it relates to a different time period should originate in that time period. If a prophet is inspired by God, then they can speak about things that are not directly related to their lifetime. But we also referred to a little verse in Isaiah 8 that talks about the followers of Isaiah preserving his words for future generations. And so we could see how there might be things that Isaiah wrote that were relevant to his time, and I think we'll come on to this as we get into the second half of Isaiah, an example of this. Things that were relevant to the time of Isaiah, but might have then been picked up and compiled and put together into the final form of the book of Isaiah that we have today as what God intended us to have, but in a way which makes it relevant to future generations, like the time of the Babylonian crisis, but then also relevant for generations way beyond that as well.
Okay, so something to look forward to. And just before we do that, we, like you've said already, we went through chapters 1 to 39, not in huge amounts of detail. I will just say this is an introduction to Isaiah, but we skipped through it. Yeah. We saw there were warnings to Judah, to the nations, God in control. There was reference to hope, that's Eden being restored, things like that. And then the famous passages about one born of a virgin, a maiden. So we had that passage as well.
Yeah, and I think that goes through to about chapter 35. And then there was 4 chapters in the last part of the section we looked at, which are historical. They don't read like the poetic, dramatic words of prophets. It's a historical narrative, and it's almost identical to the historical narrative about King Hezekiah that we find in the second book of Kings. And it's all about this Assyrian crisis, the invasion, and the rescue from it.
Yeah, great. Okay, so that it shows very clearly, doesn't it, that this book's structured around this historical event. So we've carved it up into other sorts of sections as well to help it be manageable, but there's a real key moment there. So let's turn to Isaiah 40. Now, Paul, I'm going to warn you here that these sections are some of my favourite in Scripture. I think they're probably favourite to many people because they're so profound from Isaiah 40 onwards. There's the suffering servant, the servant songs we're going to be looking at, and they're amazing. The other thing is, if we're starting with Isaiah 40, we're at risk of breaking out into song from verse 1, indeed, which I might not do, and it's almost that time of year. But
maybe not sing it, but maybe you could read just the first 5 verses.
You don't want me to sing it, Paul?
Chapter 40. No.
Okay, here goes.
This is the ESV, not King James.
That's right, it's not quite the same. So there we go. That's my excuse
of the Messiah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Handel's Messiah.
Okay, Isaiah 40. Comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that her warfare is ended, that her iniquity is pardoned, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. A voice cries, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low, and the uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken.
Yeah, so it is magnificent, isn't it? But you can see how different the tone of that is from what we looked at in the first part of Isaiah. And it's about, okay, the situation's changed. It's been reversed and her warfare is ended. She did receive for the things that consequences for her sin, yeah, but now every valley shall be lifted up. So that which was low is lifted up and things are reversed and smoothed out and the glory of the Lord revealed. It is a complete change of tone. So what we're going to do is go through, there are 3 sections in this second half of Isaiah. We've given them headings, but they merge into one another. But there are 3 sections where the focus is on particular things, I think, and we can perhaps just highlight that. So the first, chapter 40 to 48, we've called it an announcement of comfort, which we've just read about. Second section, chapters 49 to 55, a servant. It's all about a servant to be a redeemer. You talked about servant songs. That's where 3 of those appear. And then the final section, chapters 56 to 66, the servants, it's now talking about not about a servant, but about servants, plural. They inherit this great kingdom, this blessing.
Great. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. There's a question about this change of tone. Presumably it's things like that make people look at this and think, oh, this is a second Isaiah, this is someone else. Radically different tone to these 2 parts of the book. Is there anything that sort of connects it still, though, even if the tone's changed? Is there continuity?
It's just lifted into something completely hopeful and positive. And maybe you look at that and think, oh, this sounds like it's somebody else writing this rather than Isaiah of Jerusalem. But actually, I think you don't need to think and look very hard to see how this is actually a natural follow-on and a natural integrated kind of sequel to this Assyrian crisis. So if you imagine the terror of being someone living in Jerusalem and having the Assyrian hordes sweeping through the land and devastating, just burning all the crops and destroying villages, towns around Jerusalem. Jerusalem only is left. You're absolutely terrified that the only thing that you have to look forward to is a cruel and violent death at the hands of the Assyrian armies. And then suddenly that threat is removed, miraculously, but that threat is removed. And then Hezekiah, who's almost at the point of death, recovers, and suddenly everything's changed. And so you could understand why, well, there might be something written here that reflects that immense relief from that time of crisis. And there are a couple of things. If we go back into the historical accounts, first of all in 2nd Chronicles and chapter 32, and I think it's verse 22 and 23 or something like that. So 2 Chronicles 32 says, So the Lord saved Hezekiah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem from the hand of Sennacherib, king of Assyria, and from the hand of all his enemies, and he provided for them on every side. So there's a complete reversal. And many brought gifts to the Lord, to Jerusalem, and precious things to Hezekiah, king of Judah, so that he was exalted in the sight of all nations from that time onward. So you have this situation suddenly where Hezekiah is suddenly this king of renown, that the Assyrians have been overthrown and they cannot take Jerusalem because of the intervention of God in the matter. And suddenly he's seen in all the nations around. Suddenly Hezekiah is shining like a light to all the nations around as this king that was faithful to his God, Yahweh, and he was delivered. And there's another reference in 2 Kings chapter 19 and verse 29. So when Hezekiah is in the depths of this crisis, he prays and he receives a reply through Isaiah, the prophet, who comes to talk to Hezekiah and says, 2 Kings 19 verse 29, "This shall be the sign for you that he would be delivered. This year, eat what grows of itself, and in the 2nd year what springs of the same. Then in the 3rd year, and reap and plant vineyards and eat their fruit. And the surviving remnant of the house of Judah shall again take root downward and bear fruit. upward. Out of Jerusalem shall go a remnant. Out of Mount Zion a band of survivors. The zeal of the Lord will do this. So there's great fruitfulness. The land suddenly produces loads of crops, and enough to last for kind of 2 or 3 years, and when previously it had been devastated by the Assyrians. And then there's these surviving remnant that come to Jerusalem. I can't remember whether we mentioned last time Sennacherib's prism, or the Taylor prism.
Yeah, I don't think we did. So we might maybe in passing.
And so that's Sennacherib's record of this campaign in Judah. It confirms that he didn't take Jerusalem. It suddenly stops when he says, "I'm just about to take Jerusalem." And then it stops. But in that, he says he took captives from Judah. He says he took 200,150 captives. Kind of sounds like he thinks he's got about 200,000 captives, but he wants to make it sound like an absolutely precise number. So he took captives. But when the Assyrian army is overthrown and has to go, Sennacherib returns to Nineveh, then all these captives are freed and they return. And what we're getting in this second section of Isaiah is all this language about fruitfulness and plenty and restoration and returning captives and release of captives. And it does naturally flow from the aftermath of this Assyrian crisis, I think.
Yeah, okay. And textually, it follows that exact historical episode in the book that it's been written, hasn't it? And compiled like that. Okay, so that might make some sort of sense. There's a bit of a problem, isn't there, with Cyrus, though? So you need to maybe convince me a bit more, Paul. So let's just raise that. So that's in Isaiah 40, end of 44 and chapter 45. So this is the other big reason why it just feels like this is about the Babylonian context, the Babylonian crisis, because Cyrus, of course, is the Persian king, and we're talking, I think he issued his decree of saying that the Jewish people could go back to Jerusalem in 537 BC. So we're quite far ahead in time. And so it's Isaiah just reading at the end of chapter 44 about God says of Cyrus, "He is my shepherd. He shall fulfill all my purpose, saying of Jerusalem, she shall be built, and of the temple, your foundation shall be laid." And then into chapter 45, "Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him, and to loose the belts of kings, to open doors before him that gates may not be closed," and so on. And it's very much, I suppose the difficulty here is, it's either, if you don't accept that this is a book inspired by God, it's clearly then been written at the time or after Cyrus, for sure. Yeah. But even if you do, the context is about Babylon, surely, if it's about Cyrus. So, it's still later on. So how do we navigate that? Does it matter? Does it matter that it's perhaps potentially more about Babylon than Hezekiah, or is it both, or whatever? Yeah,
and I think in a few minutes here we can offer some thoughts that might be helpful, but this is the kind of thing that doctoral theses are written on, and so we won't go into that level of depth. But just so, we talked about how do we read these prophets as inspired, delivering a God-inspired, God-breathed message. How do we read it? So at one level, and you might call this the sort of conservative view, conservative principle, is that a prophet inspired by God can speak of things beyond their lifetime. So here's Isaiah of Jerusalem being inspired by God to talk about Cyrus, a figure, Cyrus the Great, that would live some, nearly 100 to 150 years later, and be able to say that. And that's perhaps what we would expect from a divinely inspired prophet. But then there's also, you might call it a critical principle, which we also referred to and said that when we're reading the prophets, we should think about the context in which they wrote and said those things and try and understand how it was relevant to their immediate audience and to their immediate situation. And that's a good principle as well. So with those two things, it would be great if they were not leading you to contradictory conclusions, but we could meet both of them. We could both recognize that a divinely inspired prophet can speak of things outside of their lifetime, but also recognize that we should think about what a prophet's saying and how it's relevant to their immediate audience. So it would be great if we could do both of that.
But have you got a suggestion as to how we might do it here?
Possibly. And I think perhaps the key to it is to go back into what we looked at last time and the last of those historical chapters in Isaiah chapter 39, which talks about something that happened at the end of Hezekiah's reign, his time as king, which was after all of this Assyrian crisis and his recovery from illness, and he lived for 15 more years after that. And in Isaiah 39, it says this: at that time, so in this extra kind of 15 years of Hezekiah's life, at that time, Merodach Baladan, the son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent envoys with letters and a present to Hezekiah. So we just saw I think it was in Kings, wasn't it, that nations, surrounding peoples hailed Hezekiah as this great king saved by Yahweh, and they brought gifts. And here's an example. And it's the king of Babylon. So there is a visit by envoys from the king of Babylon. He heard he'd been sick and he was recovered, and Hezekiah welcomed them gladly. And in fact, he showed them everything that he had in the treasury and in the house and in the temple and all the precious things he has. And then Isaiah questions Hezekiah and asks him what these men were here for and what Hezekiah showed him. And Hezekiah says, I showed them everything. And then Isaiah gives this final message at the end of chapter 39. So the days are coming when all that is in your house, that which your fathers have stored up, shall be carried to Babylon. So there is something that happens in the life of Hezekiah that connects his reign with what's going to happen later with Babylon, 100 years or so later, when the Babylonians come and take the... So there's an example of Isaiah speaking of something outside of his lifetime. But Cyrus comes even after that. He's a Persian, and he defeats the Babylonians and then causes the Jews to return to the land. So here's the king of Babylon sending these envoys. And it just so happens that at this time, Babylon wasn't as strong as Assyria. It was rising, but it wasn't as strong. And one of its allies was a country called Elam. And at this time, it had a series of kings with the name Cyrus. Cyrus was almost a throne name. And Isaiah is saying these things about the Babylonians. But then Isaiah says in his prophecy, and this Cyrus, and there's going to be a Cyrus the second, it is actually, that's going to arise. And sort of Isaiah giving a nod to that power that would arise and bring the exiles back ultimately. So that's a combination of both. Isaiah is doing both, speaking about things about Babylon and then about Persia beyond his lifetime, but saying these things in a context of an event that happened in the life of Hezekiah when these envoys from Babylon and the other allies came to Hezekiah.
Okay, let's just see if I can untangle all of that, getting deep into the weeds of Babylon's and Cyrus's and so on. So I think what we've got is a book which definitely does seem to reflect the experiences of Hezekiah and the nation at the time and the Assyrian crisis. So even this later part of Isaiah, this second Isaiah, it does reflect what happened afterwards.
Yeah.
But it also then has these forward-looking elements to it, which even they may have some relevance at the time. But what I think we landed on, that this prophecy isn't necessarily purely all about the original time. It's also forward-looking as well as relevant at the time. I think it's important to recognise the editing process, the preserving, the compiling, the bringing. That's a legitimate thing that the prophets and the people of the prophets did, and may well have brought these things together, maybe at the time of the Cyrus, who we know about, or of the time of the Babylonian exile and so on, to really show that, the crisis that Hezekiah went, that was relevant to him, and the words of Isaiah the prophet then are also relevant to us now.
But what we're trying to do is look at it from the perspective of, is there a set of circumstances in which it would have made sense to the immediate audience? And we can see that with this Babylonian visit, and you can see why Isaiah would talk about things that would happen with Babylon, use that as a springboard to that. And if there's someone representing the nation of Elam who was to become Cyrus, or where that dynasty would come from, then you can see why he would talk about Cyrus as well. And so it all originates with Isaiah of Jerusalem. But then you can also see how later compilers might just frame that material later, all under providential guidance, so that Isaiah's words are relevant to those later generations at the time of Babylon. But then, as we shall see, also contain things that are super relevant to us as well.
So let's look at the next section. So let's move on to, I think, chapters 49 to 55. So we're into the servant songs, I think. That's what I might know this section for. What do we know about them? Why do we call them servant songs?
Yeah, that's a particular feature of this section. And there are 4 little passages that are often referred to as the servant songs in Isaiah. And it's not that you would carve those out separately and just treat them as separate things. They're absolutely integrated into the surrounding text, and there's some discussion about which verses exactly form the servant songs. But the point is, it follows a train of thought which is all about how is God working in the world, and how is God seen in the earth through human beings. That's really what starts to emerge in this section in chapters 49 to 55.
So whereabouts are they? Because they are, we refer to them often, you might hear about them, but you just said this in the text, and it's actually not that clear to know exactly where they are. So maybe we can locate them.
Yeah, so if the first one is actually not in this section, 49 to 55, the first one is in the first section, in chapter 42.
Okay. There's that blending I think you spoke about.
So this is a whole tapestry of things. And in Isaiah 42, so it starts, "Behold my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry aloud or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he shall not break, and a faintly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not grow faint or be discouraged till he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands wait for his law." So I think the whole thing goes through to the end of verse 9, but I won't read it all. But there's a description there of my servant, whoever this is. And it doesn't really identify anything about the servant and who it might be. It's almost an ideal description of a servant, of the servant of God. And one of the aspects of this servant is that he is a light to the nations. So he will bring forth justice to the nations. And then in verse 6, "I will give you as a covenant for the people, as a light for the nations." So whatever this servant is, the intention is that through this person or body of people, a light is shining. God is being seen in the nations. And I think Israel, the nation of Israel, were supposed to be fulfilling that role of this ideal servant through whom God spoke, interacted, but God was doing it through Israel in order to be seen in all nations, to all nations.
Yeah, in the context of the covenant that God had with Israel, that's for precisely that purpose, isn't it? I think right back in Exodus 19, that's the covenant is because all the earth is mine. That's what God chose his people for that very reason. But they fail, don't they? And is it later in this chapter, verse 19, "Who is blind but my servant, or deaf as my messenger whom I send? Who is blind as my dedicated one, or blind as the servant of the Lord?" So the servant fails. So this servant, whoever it is that should have been listening and seeing and understanding and then proclaiming and projecting God's character, they were deaf and blind. They didn't get it. They weren't receiving the message, as it were. So Israel is failing to do that. And then now dropping properly into our section, Isaiah 49 to 55, we go to Isaiah 49, we get the second of the servant songs. It's verses 1 to 7, and let's have a look so perhaps I'll just read it from the beginning. "Listen to me, O coastlands, and give attention, you peoples from afar. The Lord called me from the womb, from the body of my mother, he named my name. He made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand he hid me. He made me a polished arrow. In his quiver he hid me away. And he said to me, you are my servant, Israel, in whom I will be glorified." So there, Israel is clearly pointed out as, Israel is the servant, in whom I will be glorified. "But I said, I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for nothing and vanity. Yet surely my right is with the Lord, my recompense with my God. And now the Lord says," verse 5, "He who formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him." So now it's switched to a singular servant, to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him, that Israel might be gathered to him. So now there's some individual, as a nation failed collectively, but now there's some individual that will pull Israel back and bring Israel back, that Israel might be gathered. So it starts off, the first one is an ideal servant, not really clear who or what it is.
This second song, Israel should have been the servant, but they didn't achieve that. And so there's going to be an individual that starts to be talked about that brings Israel back.
And just to be really, really clear, that bringing Jacob back, it's referring to Israel, isn't it? Jacob being the name of the individual who was called Israel, one of the fathers of Israel. So, using that for the whole nation. Okay, so that's really interesting. A bit of a progression going on. The people failing, so one person out of this nation becomes the individual to try and do it, to be the light to the people, to bring so that they fulfill their covenant. And then we go on to the third of these four songs, and that's in Isaiah 50, and it's normally highlighted as Isaiah 50 verses 4 to 11, and this sounds now very much more like from the perspective of this individual servant. So it starts, "The Lord God has given me the tongue of those who are taught, that I may know how to sustain with a word him who is weary." So it's this servant. How is he going to fulfill his role? How is this individual going to fulfill the role? "Morning by morning he awakens my ear to hear as those who are taught. The Lord God has opened my ear. I was not rebellious. I turned not backward." So unlike the Israel servant in the first song, who was blind and deaf and didn't hear, here this individual has got God speaking to him and he's attentive, he's listening. "I was not rebellious." And then it starts to say things like, "I gave my back to those who strike and my cheeks to those who pull out the beard. I hid not my face from disgrace and spitting." So it goes on, but it's now from the perspective of this individual and how they are responding to God's will and looking to perform it. And it's been really hard as we've started to go through this not to point forward to Jesus yet, but we're probably going to have to now. I mean, that's not a bad thing at all, because these passages are precisely the passages used in the New Testament, aren't they? About Jesus, all around this area. Some specifically from these songs are quoted about Jesus. And it's really easy to see how that he is that individual. But also trying to root this in the experiences of Isaiah and Hezekiah. He's the individual that we've thought about in the historical context, that historical section of Isaiah, that is when all the nation is completely cut up and attacked and failing. He's the one that takes this to God and somehow is a resolution to this. Is there a background here in Hezekiah?
Yeah, and he's the one who almost single-handedly drags the nation out of this crisis and brings them back to God, brings them back to Yahweh. And then we get into the fourth servant song, which is probably the most well-known and famous of them, which is Isaiah chapter 53, all of Isaiah 53. Although it's usually said that this song starts in chapter 52. So it starts with chapter 52 and verse 13. "Behold, my servant shall act wisely." You can see why they think it would start there. And then it goes right the way through into chapter 53. And you start to see how, and you can think about Hezekiah in this context as well, how he was treated by the people around him, by those that wanted to make an alliance with Egypt, and that's how they would be saved. And Hezekiah's now saying, no, stick with Yahweh and trust in him. And it talks about his appearance being so marred beyond human semblance, his form beyond that of the children of mankind. So he's deformed by something into chapter 53. "He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, as one from whom men hid their faces. He was despised and we esteemed him not." And so you have this sense of an individual who is deformed and scarred by some terrible illness. Maybe there's some speculation that it was leprosy, or a skin condition like that Hezekiah was, and when he was treated, there was something placed upon the boil, is what it describes it as. So you can see Hezekiah in this, and ultimately this song ends. We won't go on to that yet, maybe.
I think we need to find out how this song ends, Paul. Definitely Hezekiah sort of looms large in this context, for sure. So we've got the servant songs. We've got Israel is the servant of God, with a covenant, with a vocation, something that they've got to do and fulfill, to be this light to the nations, to bring all the blessing to the whole world. and yet they fail, it seems. This is what this section is about. But an individual is raised up out of this nation. One of Israel becomes that servant and manages to fulfill it, even though they are despised and are suffering and go through such terrible circumstances. And yet they're the ones through whom there is salvation and blessing and the fulfillment of the covenant. So yeah, I can see how Hezekiah sits behind that. Is that good enough?
Yeah. In verse 10, that yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. So Hezekiah had no son, no heir when he was sick and about to die. He recovered, his days were prolonged, and he then had a son, an heir. Absolutely, you can see that Hezekiah in some of those words.
We've talked about the fact that these prophecies, these servants' songs, have been replied to Jesus as well. Is there something that's more specific or more completely fulfilled in Jesus? Or is Hezekiah's fulfillment the original, the first and best fulfillment?
Yeah, and there's something particularly through this Isaiah chapter 53 that is hanging there as a question, which is this individual, is he going to die as a result of this? So there's descriptions like, okay, he's stricken, he's despised, he's suffering in all these ways. And then in verse 7, he's like a lamb that is led to the slaughter. So does this mean he's going to die? And we know what happened with Hezekiah, he recovered. But then finally, I think it's in verse 12, therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors, yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. So it finally, the question is hanging there, is he going to die? And then it finishes, yes, he does die. But out of that comes the intercession for transgressors and for sin. So it's something even more extreme than Hezekiah experienced. And it's more than a near-death experience. It is an actual death. This individual pours himself out to death. And that's where you see, obviously, a fulfillment only in Jesus of these remarkable words of Isaiah.
Yeah, okay, wonderful. Let's think about this next and final chunk of Isaiah that we've carved up. So we're into, chapters 56 now, through to the end?
56 to 66. So what's that, 11 chapters. So having seen these servant songs, and Israel failed, an individual emerged, follows the will of God, but suffers and actually dies for that. This last section almost follows through on that as to why has this individual done this and who benefits from it. Because the focus switches to talk about a multitude of servants being blessed as a result of what this one servant has done. So, for example, in Isaiah 56 and verses 6 and 7, so the foreigners who join themselves to the Lord and to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord and to be his servants, everyone who keeps the Sabbath and does not profane it and holds fast my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. So there is now to be his servants. So yes, and again in Isaiah 65, verse 8, thus says the Lord, as the new wine is found in the cluster and they say, do not destroy it, for there is a blessing in it. So I will do for my servants, plural, sake, and not destroy them. I will bring forth offspring from Jacob, and so on. So the focus has changed away from the individual to this multitude of servants who are blessed as a result of what the single individual servant has done.
Great. And then you get this really famous section in Isaiah 65, verse 17. So the new heavens and new earth. Behold, I create new heavens and a new earth. The former things shall not be remembered. And that's remarkable. What's that all about? What does it even mean?
Yeah. And there's a whole set of concepts there, aren't there, in new heavens and new earth, the sort of recreation out of a crisis for creation, if you like. There is a time of renewal, change of world order. And we're right at the end of Isaiah now, in Isaiah 65, the second from last chapter in Isaiah's prophecy. And if you recall right at the beginning, I think it was in the second chapter, there is that description that we read about, it shall come to pass in the latter days, the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains. All nations shall flow to it. And there is this Eden language and recreation. And here it is. This is how the book of Isaiah reaches its conclusion, with another description of that new heavens, new earth, and new world order. instituted to the glory of God.
Wow. Yeah. Okay, great. That seems like the point where we just need to stop and think through what we've covered.
Yeah.
The whole of Isaiah. Maybe that's proved to be too hard. You'll have to decide. If you've listened all this way to these 2 episodes and you're still none the wiser of what Isaiah is about, then listen to this summary now. Okay, so I'm going to summarize it. I think what we've looked at is we've thought about this book in its historical context. We've thought about Isaiah as a prophet and the literature of this book as the words of a prophet, and they are of their time, embedded in the life and experiences of Hezekiah, the king of Judah, around the time of the Assyrian crisis. So that's where they're rooted, where the Isaiah was. The kingdom almost fell. It was so close to being destroyed and wiped out. The seed of the house of David, the offspring of the house of David, cut off from the land of the living and gone. Almost died, but rescued. And Sennacherib didn't take the city. And therefore, this one person could bring about blessing and salvation and restore the nation of Israel. So there's that kind of historical background, and that's what Isaiah is tracking with, possibly all the way through the judgment because of the rebellion of Israel and the justice that needs to come, but judgment on nations as well, and then restoration out of that, what could be a hopeless situation, and then looking forward to the future vision of new heavens and new earth through the experiences of someone. And it's all pointing forward, isn't it? The story points forward to someone else who come in the New Testament, what we call the New Testament, who is Jesus, who is the one of humanity, of us, who, because we've all failed, is able to rescue humanity from bondage, from oppression, from slavery, from sin, and it's through his suffering, like we've seen through Hezekiah, like the servant songs and things like that. There's a lot in Isaiah and a lot we haven't looked at all, but if you're dipping in and out of it or reading it at all, there's a little, hopefully, some kind of framework to sit your studies within. Is that fair?
Yeah. Very good. Very good summary. And there's a shape to the story rooted in this life of Hezekiah, an extraordinary life. And the shape of that story, because we know about you can see that's a Jesus-shaped story, if you like, that's there. And Isaiah is building on that framework and just embellishing and doing all sorts of intricate and poetic things with different aspects of that story that is about the rescue of humanity, ultimately, from the kind of oppression of sin, bondage to sin. And it's almost like a case study we can see it because we know what Jesus is about. We can immediately see, that's why that story is that shape in Isaiah and in Hezekiah. And in the first epistle of Peter, it just comments on this and says that concerning this salvation that we can see through Jesus, the prophets who prophesied about the grace that was to be yours searched and inquired carefully, inquiring what person or time the Spirit of Christ in them was indicating when he predicted the sufferings of Christ and the subsequent glory. So that's almost just putting back into the minds of those prophets who were producing these things, these writings, by inspiration, relevant to their time, yes, but they were also thinking, this is bigger than just my life. How is it speaking of something so much bigger and greater and universal? And that's ultimately Jesus.
It certainly is. Thanks a lot, Paul, for taking us through that. So we've done 3 episodes now on prophets. We did the intro. We've done a 2-parter on Isaiah, and hopefully
should have been 3 parts, but
should have been a lot more than 3, Paul. But there we go. When we started these introduction to books, that was the challenge that was set for us, and we've ticked one of those difficult ones off. And now we've got 12 little ones to do. If that's what we're going to tackle next, that's what we said we were going to do.
What could possibly go wrong?
12 minor prophets, or are they indeed minor? And because it's taken us 2 episodes to do Isaiah, we're going to do 12 in one. I think that's fair, isn't it? So that's the plan. Whether or not that's the next episode or whether there's another one in between, who knows? We'll see. But we'll at some point look out for the Book of the 12 as we go through that. So thanks very much. Thanks for taking us through that, Paul. Thanks everyone for listening. And remember to follow us on all the socials. Hopefully you've enjoyed this, you're subscribing and finding the podcast wherever you get your podcasts.